early January 1942. Brisbane, Australia. The American military supply system was a disaster. Parts sat in warehouses guarded by red tape while combat units starved. Captain Paul Irvin Gunn had had enough. This middle-aged former Navy chief, now an Army Air Force officer, was fighting a war against both the Japanese and the knuckleheads in uniform. He recruited 2 mechanics, each carrying a Thompson submachine gun, and drove to a depot. Gunn burst through the door with a pair of Colt 45s drawn. The startled clerk froze. Gunn ordered his men to load the truck with whatever the unit needed. They hauled out parts, equipment, and supplies while he kept the clerk covered. Then they drove off. Later, Colonel John Davies saw the truck and asked where the gear came from. Gunn just said, "Do you want to know?" Davies grinned. "Get more." On January 23rd, Gunn led 14 P-40s north from Darwin in his Red Beach 18 NPC 56. Halfway across the Timor Sea, 2 Japanese Kawanishi flying boats spotted the unarmed transport. Gunn dropped to the wave tops, then dodged into a squall line. The big patrol planes chased him through the clouds, but he shook them off and landed at Kupang. On the ground, Gunn warned the Australian squadron at Kupang that the Japanese were coming. The Aussies moved their Lockheed Hudsons to a hidden strip at Mina River. Pappy coaxed a Navy destroyer to deliver fuel there. The next day, Zeros swept over Kupang and destroyed everything on the field, but the Hudsons were safe. For that, Gunn was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. In late January, Gunn took command of a battered B-17 called Miss EMF, patched together from combat damage. He flew it to Ambon just as the Japanese landed. The Dutch mechanics there refused to work overtime to repair the bomber. Pappy emerged from the fuselage with a Tommy gun and fired a burst over the head of the Dutch Commodore. "Have a seat on that barrel," he said. "You're relieved of command." The Dutch mechanics got to work. Once Miss EMF was flying again, Gunn headed for the Japanese task force off Ambon. He dove down to the wave tops and made 7 attack runs, his untrained bombardier toggling bombs at mast height. They scored no hits, but Gunn was convinced low-level bombing was the only way to sink ships. He filed that lesson away for later. On February 5th, Polly Gunn walked through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila to register her family. She did not return. The next morning, her children, Connie, Julie, Nathan, and Paul, gathered their canvas bags and rode a Kalesa to the university. They found their mother waiting for them inside. The classrooms were crammed with cots. Men, women, and children were segregated. Polly and the girls were assigned to a room on the 3rd floor. 12-year-old Nathan and his brother were placed 6 doors down in a room full of strange, hostile men. That night, all the food and soap in the boys' bags was stolen. Polly confronted the room monitor, but he shrugged. If they can't keep track of their stuff, that's their fault. An American school administrator named Godfrey Leake saw the danger. He cleared a floor of the education building for boys without fathers. Nathan and his brother moved there, away from the predatory adults. They learned quickly that in Santo Tomas, no one would protect them but themselves. On February 14th, 3 men escaped the camp. Japanese soldiers caught them within hours and tied them to stakes outside the main building. The entire camp was forced to watch. Guards whipped the prisoners with sand-filled rubber hoses until skin split and bones cracked. The men screamed. When it was over, the Japanese shot them and forced Filipino workers to bury them alive. Nathan Gunn stood in the crowd and watched. In that moment, something hardened inside the 11-year-old. The childhood games, the beach runs, the sailors who always looked after him, that world was gone. Now he had to be cold, stealthy, and willing to do whatever it took. His father had told him to take care of his mother. From now on, he would fight by 8th Avenue rules. General Wainwright's desperate radio plea for 3 million quinine tablets reached Darwin in late March. Paul Gunn saw his chance to help Bataan and maybe find his family. He stripped the Red Beach 18 down to its frame, tore out the passenger seats, and packed 5 fuel drums into the cabin. Major Cecil McFarland volunteered as co-pilot. His wife and unborn son were trapped in Cebu City. They took off at dusk on March 20th. The overloaded beach, 2,000 pounds overweight and barely climbing. 10 hours into the flight, the left engine quit in a typhoon over the Banda Sea. Gunn dropped to 600 feet and broke out of the storm at dawn. A Japanese float plane from the carrier Mizuho appeared out of the rain and opened fire. Bullets tore through the fuselage as gun aimed for a small island in the Moro Gulf. The right engine seized. He pulled the nose up just as the beach hit the beach, skidding through a taro field into a coconut grove. The wings ripped off. The last Philippine Airlines aircraft lay wrecked between the trunks. Gunn and McFarland climbed out, bruised but alive. Gunn made his way back to Australia by the end of March, hitching rides on whatever aircraft were available. At Archerfield outside Brisbane, he found a dozen new B-25 Mitchells lined up on the tarmac. Colonel John Davies stood beside him, and both men saw the same opportunity. The Mitchells were meant for the Dutch Air Force, which had lost almost all its pilots in the Java campaign. The Dutch had no crews to fly them. Davies produced an authorization from Colonel William Eubank. Together they decided the bombers would not sit idle while Japanese planes pounded New Guinea. On April 2nd, Gunn and a handful of pilots climbed into the B-25s and flew them north to Charters Towers without a single Dutch crewman aboard. The diplomatic protest arrived at headquarters within hours. That evening, Jack Fox, the North American aviation tech representative, confronted Gunn about where he had learned to fly a Mitchell. Gunn told him the truth. Fox burst out laughing and became a close ally. By early April, General Ralph Royce had assembled a strike force of 10 B-25s and 3 B-17s for a raid on Japanese targets in the Philippines. Gunn received a special mission. 2 Japanese-American counterintelligence agents needed extraction from Panay Island, along with a war correspondent and a Chinese liaison officer. Gunn flew his B-25 low over the Visayan Sea, keeping the props inches above the waves. He found the rendezvous point, a golf course outside Iloilo, and set the Mitchell down on the fairway. The 4 men climbed aboard. Gunn recognized one of the agents as Arthur Komori, a student he had taught to fly in Hawaii years before. They lifted off before the Japanese could react, Gunn staying on the deck all the way back to Del Monte. The documents the spies carried included the complete USAFFE operations journal and intelligence reports from the first months of the war. Gunn delivered his passengers safely and refueled for the next day's mission. On April 13th, Gunn attacked a Japanese cargo ship in Cebu Harbor. Instead of bombing from altitude, he dropped to the wave tops and made his run at mast height, strafing the deck as his bombardier toggled the bombs at the last instant. The ship listed afire and began to sink. General Royce ordered the entire force to withdraw to Australia. After only 1 day of operations, Gunn argued fiercely, begging to stay and use up the remaining bombs and fuel. When Royce refused, Gunn called him a coward to his face. The order stood, but Gunn refused to comply. Gunn's B-25 had been damaged, and he claimed the bomb bay fuel tank was full of holes. He stayed behind while the other bombers flew south. Working through the night with Master Sergeant Jack Evans, he salvaged wing tanks from a wrecked B-18 and hammered them into the bomb bay. He packed 18 men into the Mitchell and flew 1,500 miles back to Darwin, the last American bomber out of the Philippines. In Manila, the slow grinding of camp life wore Polly Gunn down. She watched her daughter Julie grow weaker through the spring, her spine curving inward as the pain stole her appetite and her strength. The camp hospital could not handle such a case. Polly, still wearing the red hibiscus flower she had made her talisman, began a relentless campaign against the camp bureaucracy. She badgered the internie committee, met with the Japanese administrator, Mr. Ohashi, and at last secured permission for Julie to be examined at Manila General Hospital. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. De Los Santos, determined that the spine required immobilization in a full-body cast from neck to hips to stabilize it and diminish the pain. He suspended Julie between 2 tables and built the cast around her torso. When the cast hardened, her spine cracked into place. Julie laughed and cried at the same time. The recovery would take months of proper food and bed rest, things the camp could not provide. Polly returned to Mr. Ohashi and asked for a long-term pass so Julie could convalesce outside the walls. She refused to take no for an answer. He eventually relented, and Julie was taken to the Gurevich duplex, where Eva Gurevich fed her borscht and rice. A few weeks later, Nathan Gunn suffered a severe leg infection that left him unable to walk. Polly fought the same battle again. She secured another pass, and Nathan joined his sister at the Gurevich house. There, he ate real food for the first time in months and slowly regained his strength. The family had been scattered across Manila, but each gun child still above ground was one more victory Polly would not surrender. At Charters Towers, Paul Gunn returned from the Philippines with his conviction hardened. Level bombing from altitude had failed to stop Japanese shipping. The answer, he believed, lay on the deck, mast height, full throttle, with enough firepower to suppress anti-aircraft guns before they could fire. He found a kindred spirit in Captain Don Hall, a squadron commander who had spent his pre-war career flying attack aircraft at treetop level. Together, they acquired one of the new A-20 Havocs and began to tear it apart. Gunn and his crew installed 4 Browning M250 caliber machine guns in the lower half of the nose, 2/2, with 500 rounds per gun. The weight made the aircraft sluggish and nose heavy. Gunn added a 450-gallon fuel tank in the forward bomb bay to restore the center of gravity, then fitted tail weights to bring the balance back. They took the modified A-20 to the gunnery range outside Charters Towers. Gunn climbed into the pilot's seat, advanced the throttles, and dropped the nose toward a ground target. When he pressed the trigger, 4 streams of lead converged into a single cone of fire. Trees disintegrated. A truck-sized patch of earth vanished into flying splinters and dust. On later runs, the crew accidentally shredded a rancher's wandering steer. The firepower was brutal, absolute, and exactly what the 3rd Attack Group needed. Don Hall test flew the aircraft and confirmed what the range had already proved. The strafer worked. Colonel Davies gave the order to begin converting more A-20s. A new weapon had entered the Pacific War. By July, the situation in New Guinea had grown desperate. The Japanese army pushed across the Owen Stanley Range along the Kokoda Trail. Port Moresby, the last Allied stronghold on the island, was only 30 miles from being overrun. General George Kenney had arrived in theater that same month to replace the previous Allied air commander. He was a civil engineer by training, a former World War I fighter pilot, and a man with little patience for rigid doctrine. On August 5th, Kenney flew into Charters Towers and toured the hangars. In a canvas tent converted into a workshop, he found Gunn working in the stifling heat, the only man in the room still wearing a long-sleeved shirt. Kenney began asking technical questions. Gunn recognized immediately that this general spoke the language of engineers. Kenney listened to Gunn describe the A-20 modifications and the plan for even heavier armament on the B-25. He walked through the hangar, inspected the work, and asked Gunn to introduce each enlisted mechanic by name. The general saw in this middle-aged captain a man who could turn scrap and stubbornness into combat power. Before leaving, Kenney told Davies to order more conversions. The strafers would be mass-produced. The old methods of high-altitude bombing had failed. The new tactics of low-level attack would define the 5th Air Force. For Gunn, the endorsement was the first real support he had ever received from a senior officer. He later said that Kenney saved him, that the general arrived just as he was losing his sanity. Gunn could not sit idle while his gunships were being built. In late August, he flew north to Port Moresby in a B-25, unarmed and unannounced, to support the ground troops fighting along the Kokoda Trail. Once in theater, he joined Captain Don Hall's squadron and flew a modified A-20 on combat sorties. The Japanese were starving. Their supply lines broken, but they still fought with fanatical tenacity. Gunn flew low-level ground support missions, strafing and bombing Japanese positions to take pressure off the exhausted Australian defenders. During one of these sorties, he took his pet lizard Sam along in the cockpit. Sam had grown accustomed to the noise and vibration of the aircraft, often perching on Gunn's throttle arm and dozing as the engines roared. Ground fire struck his A-20 Havoc during a strafing run in late August. A piece of shrapnel burst through the side of the cockpit. It impaled Sam, passed clean through Gunn's arm, and pinned him to the armrest. Gunn flew back to Port Moresby with the lizard dying on his hand. When the ground crew cut him out of the cockpit, they found him still bleeding, groaning over the animal. "They got Sam," he said. "The goddamn bastards got Sam," the loss of the lizard, after the months of separation from his family, the destruction of his airline, and the death of so many friends deepened something inside him. He did not speak of the incident afterward, but those who flew with him saw the change. The engineering work, the all-night modifications, the relentless pace, none of it was just about winning a war anymore. It had become personal. By October 1942, Paul Gunn had returned to Australia from Port Moresby. Kenny had seen the A-20 strafers work, and he wanted the same treatment for the B-25. Gunn threw himself into the design, working alongside Jack Fox and the squadron armorers. They stripped out the bombardier's station and installed 450 caliber machine guns in the nose. 4 more went into side-pack blisters below the cockpit. Each gun held 500 rounds. The bomb bay was modified to carry extra fuel tanks, giving the Mitchell the range to reach Japanese shipping lanes. Skip bombing had already been tested by B-17 crews. Gunn's commerce destroyers would deliver that payload from mast height, using the forward guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire before the bombs ever left the racks. Back in Manila, Nathan Gunn had recovered enough to return to Santo Tomas. He was walking the grounds with his brother Paul one afternoon when they slipped into the empty seminary storage room. In the dim light, a stuffed gorilla stood propped against the wall. They heard footsteps drop low and watched Don Bell creep in. Bell reached into the gorilla's rear and pulled out a shortwave radio. He pressed it to his ear, listened for a minute, then tucked it away and left. The boys understood what they had seen. That radio was the only link to the outside world. They never told a soul. On March 2, 1943, reconnaissance aircraft spotted a massive Japanese convoy steaming toward Leh. The following morning, General George Kenny ordered every available bomber and fighter into the air to destroy it before it could land. 8 transports and 8 destroyers carried an entire infantry division with enough supplies to fight for months. The B-25 gunships of the 90th Bomb Squadron led the attack. They dove to mast height, their 8 forward firing 50 calibers pouring fire into the destroyers' decks. Anti-aircraft gunners died at their posts and the ship's defenses collapsed. Then the skip bombs came, each one skipping across the water like a stone and punching through the thin hulls of the transports. Pappy Gunn hitched a ride in a B-17 that afternoon and watched the carnage from above. He never spoke of it afterward. 2 weeks later, Gunn flew to the United States with a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. Inside were still photographs and combat footage from the gunship's nose cameras. He was ordered to report to General Henry Arnold at the Pentagon. The engineers at Wright Field had already insisted such modifications could not be made. Arnold screened the combat footage without comment. His staff watched destroyers disintegrate under streams of 50 caliber fire. The silence in the room spoke louder than any argument. Arnold approved mass production of the Strafer B-25 on the spot. The design would be standardized and built at modification centers across the country. Gunn then stopped in Pensacola to visit his in-laws. He had received no word from his family since December of 1941. His father-in-law handed him a postcard that had finally made its way across the world. The postmark was Manila. The postcard was from Polly. She wrote that she and the children were alive, interned at Santo Tomas. Gunn read the words 3 times, his hands trembling. He sat down on the porch and wept. For the first time in 16 months, he knew they were alive. He vowed then that he would get them out. The gunships were the instrument. The war was the path. He would fly back to Australia and keep pushing until he landed on Luzon himself. The modifications he pioneered became standard on hundreds of B-25s. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that low-level attack could cripple Japanese logistics. The road back to the Philippines was open. Gunn had a reason to follow it. Colonel John Davies went on to command a B-29 wing. Jack Fox returned to North American aviation to standardize the modifications for mass production. Major Cecil McFarland survived the war and was reunited with his wife and son. Captain Don Hall led his A-20 squadron through the rest of the New Guinea campaign. Master Sergeant Jack Evans served alongside Gunn until the end of the conflict. Gunn never stopped fighting his way back toward Manila, determined to free his family from Santo Tomas. After the war, he founded a cargo airline, but on October 11, 1957, he was killed in the crash of a civilian DC-3 in the Philippines. His gunship modifications had changed how the Pacific Air War was fought. If you have family stories from the war in the Pacific, we would love to hear them in the comments. Please take a moment to subscribe and give this video a like. Thank you for watching. and for keeping this history alive.